In Eisenhower's Lieutenants, eminent historian Stanley Weintraub wrote that communications in the 1800s between America's scattered frontier garrisons were slow, which encouraged a tradition of individual initiative in the American Army. This tradition served America well in the fast-moving battles of World War II. He also wrote that the U.S. Army in World War II was the most mobile army in history. The U.S. built 800,000 2.5-ton trucks alone, as well as impressive numbers of other models. But to enhance that mobility, America created lightly armed divisions that did not have the firepower to do well in grueling positional battles. The defeat of the German forces in Brittany is a good place to examine Dr. Weintraub's arguments. When the Allies gained entry into Brittany after the Normandy invasion by capturing bridges at Outran, the battle shifted from bludgeoning the way through hedgerows to moving quickly to exploit the disarray of the scattered German forces. It ended with a campaign to capture the fortress city of Brest that involved some of the heaviest fighting that had yet taken place in the European theater. The remarkable speed of the American advance outran communications and forced the leaders of detached forces to use initiative to take advantage of fleeting opportunities. Fortunately, they were prepared to do so by training and tradition. The battle against the strong defenses of Brest, which were manned by a heavily armed garrison about the size of the attacking forces, was a grueling fight that needed considerable firepower to win. The Brittany campaign did not unfold as the Allies expected. Had the Germans acted rationally, the battle for France would have been a long series of Allied attacks to drive back the German infantry while fending off counterattacks by Germany's mobile forces. The expectation was that the Germans would retreat as needed while inflicting as many casualties as possible on the Allies. But Hitler's lack of understanding of mobile warfare and his growing distrust of his generals produced a very different battle. His insistence on never giving up ground meant that the German mobile forces that arrived early in the battle for Normandy were squandered attempting to hold defensive positions. The front became so brittle that there was no way to seal off the Operation Cobra breakthrough. The plan the Allies developed before D-Day was based on the assumption that, as the battle moved north toward Germany, the Germans would deny the Allies the use of the ports in northern France and Belgium as long as they could. So the U.S. needed to be able to bring huge quantities of supplies ashore in Brittany. The Germans were expected to destroy the existing port facilities, so any tonnage that could be put through the captured ports would be a bonus. Most of the supplies would come through an artificial harbor, similar to the Normandy mulberries, to be constructed in Quiberon Bay.
To keep German garrisons in nearby cities from firing on naval convoys, the U.S. needed to capture Rennes, Brittany's main communication center, cut across the base of the Brittany Peninsula to Quiberon, capture that port, and the ports of Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire on the south coast of the peninsula. Hitler had declared the coastal cities were to be fortresses and garrisoned, usually with second-class troops, to deny the Allies the use of those ports for as long as possible. This cost the Germans between 180,000 and 280,000 men. Historians are divided about the wisdom of the decision. By the time of the breakout, the Germans had largely denuded the peninsula of the better units there, and the Allies hoped that the ports would fall after brief, token defenses. Instead of the coherent defense the planners had expected before the Normandy invasion, what was left of the German forces in the interior of Brittany were small garrisons that were trying to gather in German-controlled areas. The shattering German defeat at Falaise in August 1944 turned Allied attention to the north. Coincidentally, the attack on Brest began the same day as the Allied troops pursuing the Germans crossed the Seine. When the decision was made to attack that city, the Allies were only beginning to realize that their plans for Brittany needed to be adjusted to take advantage of the enormous opportunities the German collapse in Normandy presented. The Brittany campaign was in the hands of two commanders with wildly contrasting styles. The brilliant, flamboyant 3rd Army commander, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., and Major General Troy Middleton, who commanded 8th Corps. Middleton was a steady and methodical planner, while Patton was renowned as a hard-charging, hell-bent-for-leather leader. Third Army Headquarters estimated that the divisional artillery of 2 divisions, augmented by 10 battalions of artillery assigned to Middleton's corps, a total of 18 battalions, would provide adequate support for the attackers.
In fact, the area defended by the Germans was so large that it took 3 divisions, supported by an additional 18 battalions of artillery, plus 4.2-inch mortars whose round had the same explosive power as a 105mm artillery shell, and the fire of tank destroyer battalions acting as artillery, a total of 34 battalions, to envelop the Germans' positions. In addition, as was normal in the European theater, Middleton's forces were not significantly more numerous than the defenders. Allied plans changed several times, but Patton settled on having the 4th Armored Division capturing Rennes and Nantes, then moving west to capture Vannes and screen the German positions around Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. The 6th Armored Division, under Major General Robert Weif, capturing Vannes and screen the German positions around Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. The 6th Armored Division, under Major General Robert Y. Gros, was tasked with moving through the interior of the peninsula to test the defenses of Brest and, hopefully, capture it. Task Force A moved out ahead of the main body of the 6th Armored. It consisted of Tank Destroyer Brigade headquarters that controlled the following units: a group of armored cavalry and another group of tank destroyers. The term tank destroyer, as used here, referred to a lightly armored tracked vehicle carrying a high-velocity cannon in an open turret. Groups, as the term was used by the Army at the time, consisted of 2 battalion-sized units and a headquarters. Task Force A also included a battalion of engineers and a separate pontoon bridge company. The task force, whose mission was to prevent the Germans from blowing bridges and to secure the railroad line to Brest, was later augmented with a battalion of infantry. There were already Allied covert operations troops operating in Brittany, with approximately 20,000 armed French forces of the interior, FFI. They were attacking small parties of Germans, preventing German sabotage, and providing intelligence to Allied forces. Task Force A made contact with them on August 6th and found that they had largely cleared the Germans out of the interior of the peninsula. They directed Task Force A around remaining German concentrations and guarded the captured bridges and other targets. With their help, the task force's mission was successful and the railroad and highways stayed open. Before it was dissolved, the task force had captured 5,700 prisoners.
As the 6th Armored moved forward, an unexpectedly tough fight was developing for the ports of St. Malo and Dinard to the north at the base of the Brittany Peninsula. Patton had told Gros to head directly to Brest as fast as possible. Since Patton gave the order directly to Gros, Middleton knew nothing of it, nor did he know that the division's forward elements were well past the ports. Middleton ordered it to halt in place in anticipation that the division would be needed to help reduce those ports. When Patton learned of Middleton's instruction, he controlled his famous temper and got the 6th on the road again. Combat Command A moved west parallel the north coast, and Combat Command B, and later Combat Command Reserve, moved down the center of the peninsula. In addition to Task Force A, Middleton strengthened the division with another battalion of tank destroyers, a battalion of self-propelled 155s, and a battalion of anti-aircraft artillery. Middleton complained that his armored divisions had moved so far and fast that he had no idea of where they were. This was a constant problem for both sides during this phase of the campaign. Neither side's signal equipment was up to handling the distances involved and volume of traffic, although the communications personnel mitigated the problem by successfully putting telephone lines the Germans had strung back into operation. The 6th Armored's tanks' entry to Lezineven signaled the 266th Volksgrenadier Division that the time had come for the Germans to destroy the 280mm guns at Paimpol and withdraw to Brest. The German 7th Army headquarters could not believe that the American unit had moved so fast, and the 266th was ordered to return to its positions on the north coast of Brittany. Initially, the Americans seriously underestimated German strength in Brittany. Patton told Middleton that there were only 1,000 Germans between St. Malo and Brest. The 6th Armored captured 10,000. When the 6th reached Brest, Gros ordered Combat Command B to test the defenses. The attack drove in some outposts, but was stopped. It was clear that a substantial force of infantry, supported by much artillery, would be needed for a successful assault.
While the 6th was waiting for infantry, parties of German troops began harassing the division trains and sniping at division artillery. Their commander was captured while moving ahead of his main body, and the attackers were identified as the same 266th VG that had tried to move earlier. Because of 7th Army interference, it was only now attempting to reach Brest. Only about 1,000 troops made it to the city. Meanwhile, Major General John S. Wood's 4th Armored Division reached Rennais on August 1st. As a transportation hub, the city was just as important to the Germans as it was to the Allies, and small German detachments were drawn to it. The garrison was large enough to beat off a probe by the 4th Spearhead and another attack later in the day. Wood needed time to get an additional infantry regiment from Middleton to supplement the limited infantry component of his division for the street fighting he saw coming.
Wood had the city encircled when the 13th Infantry Regiment of the 8th Infantry Division arrived on August 2nd. On the 3rd, they penetrated the city, and that night the remains of the garrison successfully exfiltrated to the south, eventually reaching the German-controlled fortress city of Saint-Nazaire. There was a delay before Wood's CCEA headed south for its next assignment. Once resupplied, CCA seized the port of Nantes, closing off the lower Loire river crossings, and completed the capture of Vannes that the FFI had already begun. It was soon joined by the rest of CCB, which had seized the crossroads towns of Roudon and Chateaubriand. Near Lorient, it had mistakenly bivouacked in an open field well within the range of the German guns defending the city, and only 800 yards from a German observer with a clear view of the bivouac. The barrage the Germans subjected them to caused more casualties than any other encounter since they had landed. Because the Allies belatedly realized that the real fight had become the advance into Germany, they never attacked the cities of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, which remained in German hands until the end of the war. Task Force A passed through Avranches on August 1, and the 6th Armored's probing attack on Brest took place on August 7th. Brest lies 200 miles west of the starting point of the campaign. In between, there were ambushes to avoid by countermarching, detouring, and skirmishing with isolated parties of Germans. It was an exhausting campaign. In one headquarters, several officers fell asleep during a conference. By tracing the paths of units on maps of the campaign, it appears that some units advanced well over 200 miles by the time Brest was invested. It was a splendid performance that fully demonstrated the mobility of the American Army and the quality of the units that had been built for this war. Major General Robert Wood Grow, the 6th Armored's commander, was rightly proud, even elated by the performance of his division. He had received the cavalryman's mission from a cavalryman, Patton. It was the kind of campaign they had trained for and been denied in Normandy. His division was independent of higher command in its advance from Avranches to Brest, taking advantage of the American tradition of individual initiative that allowed units to improvise when the unexpected occurred and direction from higher headquarters was lacking. Its move was the most extended operation of any single division in the war. Its success was measured by the fact that by the second week in August, single travelers could travel the length of the Brittany Peninsula in safety. Only the spectacular victory further north at Falaise obscured the achievement. Dr. Weintraub's assertion that the U.S. Army had become the most mobile in history was clearly correct. The campaign also illustrated how the American Army had mastered what later became known as the air-land battle. In the German Army in 1940, a request to the Luftwaffe for air support had to come from an Army headquarters. In 1944, American captains were calling for strikes, often conducted by airplanes that were overhead waiting for the call. The first phase of the campaign to conquer Brittany ended when Middleton relieved the 6th Armored and General Omar Bradley ordered 3 infantry divisions into the battle for Brest. The 2nd Infantry Division deployed on the left, the 8th in the center, and the 29th on the right flank. The opponents. The armies that faced each other in this battle had been developing in very different ways during the last few years. The 2nd Division, commanded by Major General Walter M. Robertson, was a regular army division formed during World War I that continued on active duty between the wars. It was substantially understrength until its ranks were filled out with draftees. The 8th, commanded by Major General Donald A. Stroh, was also formed during World War I but was deactivated after it ended. It was reactivated for World War II, and outside of the key leadership cadre, it was made up of almost all draftees. The 29th, commanded by Major General Charles Gerhardt, was initially a National Guard division made up mostly of Maryland soldiers, but there had been many transfers before the 29th went into combat on June 6th at Omaha Beach and had heavy casualties since. These had been replaced without regard to where in the U.S. they came from. The 2nd had also taken heavy casualties in Normandy, but effective commanders knew the importance of integrating replacements into their units. The best procedure was to pull the unit receiving the replacements into reserve before their replacements arrived and give it time to school them in what they would find when they went into combat.
America was able to supply all its divisions with standardized equipment, giving all divisions of a given type of approximately equal firepower. The main difference was that the longer a division served in combat, the more automatic weapons and mortars they tended to accumulate in excess of the tables of organization allowances. They were typical of the divisions America was sending into combat at this stage of the war. They had all been through long periods of training before going into combat. Surveys and a report compiled by Eisenhower's headquarters show that the troops felt that their weapons and equipment were, on balance, better than what the Germans used. Granted, there were strong arguments for confining the Sherman to an infantry support role after the African campaign and deploying a heavier tank earlier in the war. Infantry companies could have used a more portable machine gun and a larger allowance of them. But as historian Charles MacDonald put it, the American Army suffered so much from Depression-era neglect that many times the Army had to simply aim for adequacy in choosing equipment. These divisions were defined more by the very similar training programs they completed after the war began than by their pre-war history. As a result, American divisions serving in the European theater at this time were generally interchangeable with other divisions of the same type. The major difference between these three was that the 2nd had an exceptional commander in General Robertson. America's personnel policies tended to keep divisions interchangeable. The American training programs for replacements was conducted by a central command and usually lasted considerably longer than German programs. More importantly, American divisions were never so reduced by casualties as to lose their identities. Unlike German Corps and Army commanders, American commanders could look at their units' past accomplishments as a reliable indicator of future performance.
There were exceptions. The divisions that were hurried off to Africa 11 months after Pearl Harbor did not have as long to train together as divisions that deployed later, but those deficiencies were corrected by the time they reached Europe. A much higher proportion of American casualties were infantrymen than the planners anticipated, so there were never enough trained infantrymen, and at times later in the war, their training was sketchy. The last few divisions that deployed to Europe had their trained men sent to fill slots in units already in theater, and their replacements had no time to train together. America had few elite infantry units at the beginning of WW2, but in addition to the airborne, the U.S. formed Ranger battalions that were patterned on the British commandos and given especially tough training. They were intended for raids and attacks across especially difficult terrain, but higher commanders often had no clear idea of how to use them, and they were given more mundane assignments like guarding prisoners. The German army had moved in an entirely different direction. At the beginning of their rearmament in the 1930s, Germany had attempted to train all their divisions to the same high standard and equip them uniformly, an unattainable goal. German industry was also unable to supply Germany's needs. At best, Germany was able to equip its frontline and mobile units with 7.92 caliber Mauser rifles, 9mm pistols, and machine pistols, and those units always seemed to have sufficient MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns. For the rest of their divisional equipment, even frontline divisions were forced to use an enormous variety of non-standard and captured equipment. The elite 6th Parachute Regiment was formed late in the war. It had only 70 trucks for its 3,400 men. There were 50 different models. The weapons and equipment of the second-line static divisions were even more diverse and had less organic transport and artillery. So the weapons and equipment could vary greatly from division to division. In Brest, for example, in addition to the guns assigned to the units in the garrison, Germans manned the guns the French had installed, then they removed guns from sunken warships in Brest Harbor and installed a battery of captured Soviet 122mm field guns.
The German manpower situation was similar. Initially, a German infantry division was substantially larger than an American division, and the table of organization included anti-aircraft and reconnaissance units. There was also substantially more firepower in the infantry regiments. Mr. Browning's automatic rifle has its merits, but where the U.S. had one in each rifle squad, the Germans had a belt-fed MG-34 or MG-42 and more guns at the company level. There were also normally many more machine pistols than the U.S. Army issued submachine guns. But in 1943, Germany adopted a new table of organization for its infantry or Volksgrenadier divisions that attempted to produce the same amount of firepower with significantly fewer men. The size of the rifle squads and the rifle companies were reduced, and the number of infantry battalions was reduced from 9 to 6. A Fusilier battalion replaced the reconnaissance battalion and usually ended up being used as a 7th Infantry Battalion. There were also substantial reductions in the service and support troops. Even more machine pistols were issued to compensate for the reduction in the number of shooters. German casualties had been heavy, and the need for troops was so great that physical standards were reduced, and Volksdeutsch, men from Germanic stock from the conquered territories, were drafted. Volunteers from non-German countries were encouraged to enlist in Hitler's anti-Bolshevik crusade. There were great variations in the quality of the manpower allotted to different types of divisions. This was deliberate. As the successive conscript classes were brought into the army, the best soldiers usually ended up in one of the elite units. Germany still had some elite Panzer, Panzergrenadier, and parachute divisions manned with healthy young men. The Allies encountered several of them in Normandy, and much of their line infantry was still quite good. But their commanders probably wished that they had spent more of their time training and less time working on fortifications and beach obstacles. The level of training varied from division to division. Even new infantry divisions that were given long enough to carry out a real training program, such as the 352nd VG Division that appeared at Omaha Beach, fought quite respectably. Toward the end of the war, it was German practice to leave an infantry division in combat until it was so worn down that it was deemed to be combat ineffective. Then it was rebuilt. Toward the end of the war, new conscripts were given only 4 to 6 weeks of rudimentary training before going into combat. Beginning in 1943, Germany began fielding another category of infantry divisions that were less capable than the Volksgrenadier units, coastal defense or static divisions. These units lacked a reconnaissance battalion and had less transport and artillery than the field units. What they did have varied based on what was available and the length of stretch of coastline they were defending. They were often manned by men who had lost their youthful ability to withstand hardship or were less than enthusiastic about serving the Third Reich. This was especially true of Ost battalions manned by volunteers drawn from captured Soviet troops that were transferred from the Eastern Front. The Allies found that the Ost troops would surrender at the first opportunity, but for the rest, it did not take much enthusiasm or youthful vigor to defend a prepared position.